Behind the most famous smile in American television, there was a man who harbored grudges, awkward silences, and a secret list of guests he vowed never to have on his show again. For decades, Johnny Carson was the undisputed king of late night, the master of elegant irony and seemingly casual interviews on The Tonight Show. But what the public didn't see were the tense behind-the-scenes moments, the cold stares during commercial breaks, and the ruthless decisions made away from the cameras. In today's video, you'll discover that not everyone survived Carson's sharp humor, and some names on that list will truly shock you. We're talking about silent confrontations, massive egos clashing live on air, and moments when charm gave way to absolute disdain. There are stories of guests who challenged his authority on stage, celebrities who dared to try and steal his spotlight, and even stars who were banned after comments considered acts of betrayal. One of these figures was so influential that the rivalry practically became a television Cold War, reshaping the entertainment industry. Another surprised Carson live, breaking the script and leaving the host visibly irritated in front of millions of viewers. And the name at the top of the list is someone you probably never imagined. The tension between them was so intense that producers had to step in behind the scenes. The most intriguing part is that Carson rarely exploded. He simply smiled and then made sure that person would never set foot in his studio again. Throughout this video, we'll reveal the most controversial episodes, unresolved resentments, and the behind-the-scenes drama that NBC preferred to keep hidden from the public. If you think you know television history, get ready to see the dark side of one of pop culture's greatest icons. Before we continue, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because here we reveal what no one else has the courage to tell. And comment down below, which of these rivalries surprised you the most? Stick with me until the end, because the final revelation about who occupies #1 on this list will completely blow your mind. Before becoming the master of The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson was just a lonely boy, observing the world through the curtain of his own shyness, hiding giant dreams behind an uncertain smile. John William Carson was born on October 23, 1925, in Corning, Iowa, but spent much of his childhood in Norfolk, Nebraska, a small town that shaped his observant sense of humor and his ability to notice the subtlest details of people. The son of Homer Lloyd Carson, a strict electricity salesman, and Ruth Carson, a protective mother, Johnny grew up in a relatively traditional household, yet one marked by small tensions and familial expectations. From an early age, he demonstrated a talent for entertainment, fascinated by magic tricks, radio, and the idea of capturing people's attention. However, while he delighted family members and neighbors with his performances, he carried a deep insecurity. Childhood friends remembered Johnny as someone capable of making people laugh with just a gesture, yet offstage, he avoided prolonged interactions, preferring to observe in silence, absorbing every detail of others' reactions. This duality between exuberant talent and inward reserve would become a hallmark of his personality throughout his life. During high school, Carson participated in school theater programs and talent shows, yet he still struggled with extreme self-criticism and the fear of not being accepted. From a young age, he created a public persona, the charismatic, confident, and funny boy, while internally questioning every word and gesture. This behavior, far from mere shyness, was a form of self-protection that would later help him control the stage and cameras, but also made intimate and spontaneous relationships more difficult. At the age of 18, he enlisted in the Navy during World War II, an experience that reinforced his discipline, patience, and sense of responsibility, but also intensified his emotional isolation, as coping with military rigidity and the proximity of death demanded almost superhuman self-control. Even during military service, Carson continued practicing his entertainment skills, performing shows for his shipmates, always seeking approval while maintaining a certain emotional distance. This phase of his life, marked by achievements and small victories, also revealed darker traits: the fear of failure, the feeling of being constantly evaluated, and the need to hide vulnerable emotions, fears that would accompany him forever. After returning to civilian life, he enrolled at the University of Nebraska, initially studying veterinary medicine before surrendering to his passion for radio and entertainment, a decision reflecting his silent and persistent ambition. During these college years, Carson began shaping the style that would make him famous: sharp humor, impeccable timing, meticulous observation of human behavior, and above all, the ability to turn his own insecurity into a comedic weapon, using irony and charm to captivate audiences and disarm criticism. In essence, Johnny Carson's childhood and adolescence were a laboratory of personality, where every insecurity, every silence, and every smile hid the seed of an entertainment genius, capable of effortlessly captivating the public while simultaneously keeping his inner world protected, secret, and impenetrable. It was during this period, filled with contrasts between brilliance and introspection, that Carson learned the art of observing, understanding, and manipulating situations, traits that would define not only his career but also his personal life, full of complicated relationships, prolonged silences, and a perfectionism that would accompany him to his final days. His childhood was not marked by great tragedies, but by the meticulous construction of a character who, despite appearing confident and charming, concealed deep layers of vulnerability, curiosity, and silent ambition, essential ingredients for the icon he would become. Behind the flawless smile and sharp humor that won over millions, Johnny Carson paid a silent price that few could imagine, and not all the applause in the world could ease the weight of fame. When Carson took over The Tonight Show in 1962, he was not just stepping into the role of a television host, he was ascending to the throne of one of America's greatest cultural influences, a space where every word, every gesture, and every glance were watched and analyzed by the entire country. His rise was not a smooth path. Although he appeared naturally charismatic on camera, behind the scenes he was meticulous, strategic, and often relentless. Carson had a rare talent for balancing charm with authority, but that very talent demanded enormous personal sacrifices. He dedicated endless hours to preparation, reviewing scripts, carefully selecting jokes, and studying the personality of each guest, because any slip could ruin his perfect image. This obsession with control also extended to his professional relationships. He maintained a list of unwanted guests, was known to cut ties silently, and upheld strict standards about who deserved his stage and who did not. The public saw a funny, elegant, and kind man, but colleagues knew that Carson could be cold and distant, and that his decisions, though rarely expressed in harsh words, were final and unyielding. This hidden side of fame, the constant tension between pleasing millions and maintaining his own artistic integrity, followed him throughout his career. The pressure was invisible to those watching from the other side of the screen, yet it shaped every interview, every joke, every moment of improvisation on stage. Carson understood that television was not just entertainment, it was power, and power demanded sacrifices that included privacy, rest, and at times his own inner peace. Even on the most memorable nights, when the audience laughed and NBC recorded record ratings, he carried a keen awareness that every choice came with a price, and that not all relationships would survive the spotlight. His rise to the TV throne is a story of genius and discipline, but also of solitude and inner rigor, showing that absolute success in public life often hides a far more complex inner world, full of tensions, difficult decisions, and the constant balance between being loved by the audience and maintaining the authority that made him an eternal icon. Behind Johnny Carson's charming smile, there was a man whose love life was as turbulent as his jokes were sharp. a man who, despite making millions laugh, faced silent battles in his heart. Johnny Carson, the legendary host of The Tonight Show, had 4 marriages throughout his life, each marked by dramatic highs and lows that frequently attracted the curious eyes of the press and the public. His first marriage was to Jody Wolcott, young and promising, but the relationship quickly ran into difficulties due to Carson's demands and the weight of his growing fame. The marriage ended in divorce, leaving the host more reserved and aware of the difficulty of balancing his intense career with a fulfilling personal life. His second marriage to Joanne Copeland also faced challenges. While Carson was immersed in his television responsibilities and in developing his iconic style of humor, Joanne sought more emotional closeness and stability, something Carson, with his tendency to maintain emotional distance, could not fully provide. This relationship ended turbulently, reflecting Carson's struggle to reconcile his personal life with the flawless public image he maintained before millions of viewers. The third marriage, to Joanna Holland, brought financial and trust issues to the forefront, culminating in a highly publicized divorce that made national headlines not only because of the settlement amount, but also due to its emotional impact on Carson, who was known for avoiding open conflict, yet accumulated silent resentments that weighed heavily on him. Finally, his fourth marriage to Alexis Moss was different. Alexis managed to understand Carson's complexity, his perfectionism, his emotional reserves, and his past scars, providing him with a safe haven that lasted until his final days. Despite finding some stability with Alexis, friends and biographers describe Carson as a man who always struggled to open up fully, feeling more comfortable in front of the cameras than in intimate moments of vulnerability. Additionally, reports indicate that Carson maintained a limited social life, carefully choosing his friendships and interactions, often avoiding situations that might expose his insecurities or weaknesses. This difficulty in connecting emotionally also reflected in his relationships with his children and close family, creating an image of a brilliant public man but a deeply private individual, a contrast that makes his personal story as fascinating as the iconic moments he commanded on stage. Throughout his life, Johnny Carson showed that no matter how someone may dominate the entertainment world and make millions laugh, their love life and emotional world do not always follow the same script, and even the most charismatic man can carry internal battles that few can see. This human side of Carson, full of vulnerabilities and complex choices, is essential to understanding not only the television icon, but the man behind the legend, a man who loved, erred, suffered, and ultimately found peace in the late stability of his final relationship. Behind Johnny Carson's elegant smile and perfect joke, there existed a secret list of guests he simply refused to welcome back. And the number one on that list became a legend almost as famous as the host himself. Carson was a master at maintaining composure in front of the cameras, but behind the scenes, he had his own rules, strict and often relentless. Joan Rivers, perhaps the most controversial name, was the person Carson could least tolerate after the professional break that shook the television world. Rivers had worked with Carson as part of The Tonight Show, practically protected and mentored by him until she decided to host her own competing show without consulting her mentor. For Carson, this was seen as a personal betrayal, something he never forgave, and she was quietly banned from his studio, her name virtually erased from his radar in the years that followed. But Rivers was not the only one. Other comedians and celebrities, often for minor provocations, out-of-context remarks, or attempts to steal the spotlight during the show, ended up on the host's blacklist. Some names included actors who displayed arrogance, or in his eyes disrespected the delicate art of conducting a late-night interview with elegance and subtlety. What makes it even more fascinating is that Carson rarely displayed anger explicitly. He didn't need to. A cold look, A prolonged silence backstage, or simply the absence of invitations was enough for a guest to understand they had crossed the line. Colleagues and producers recall that he liked to maintain this distance as a form of control, and that the list of banned guests was a mix of personal resentments and very specific professional criteria, always with a touch of biting humor that only he could master. In Joan Rivers' case, the story reached almost mythical proportions, becoming a symbol of how Carson managed to combine talent, power, and discipline in an almost impenetrable way. He rarely commented on these cases in interviews, but when he did, his statements were enigmatic, almost provocative, suggesting that he firmly believed in preserving the integrity of the show and his personal legacy above any friendship or professional convenience. This fueled endless speculation about other names that might be on the list, creating an aura of mystery that surrounded his career until the very end. Today, even years after his death, this rivalry is remembered as one of the most intriguing episodes in American television, and it continues to spark curiosity about what really happened behind the scenes of The Tonight Show, proving that behind Carson's humor and genius, there was a man capable of keeping secrets, holding grudges, and deciding who truly deserved his respect and who would never cross his path again. The list of banned guests, and especially the number one, remains a fascinating chapter in TV history, reminding everyone that behind every famous smile are personal decisions that shape legacies and provoke discussion decades later. Few know, but behind Johnny Carson's flawless smile and sharp elegance, there was a silent storm that few dared to imagine. Throughout his career, Carson built an image as the master of late-night humor, always confident, always in control. But behind the cameras, his personal life was far from as orderly as it seemed. His public statements, rare and carefully measured, often concealed deep frustrations and controversial opinions that only a few close confidants ever knew. He was not the type to expose himself easily, but when he allowed himself to speak in interviews or private conversations, his words revealed a side that was controversial, cynical, and even surprisingly vulnerable. For example, Carson did not shy away from criticizing guests he considered arrogant or disrespectful, and often his silent disdain spoke louder than any public remark could express. Behind-the-scenes stories indicate that he held long-lasting resentments, as in the case of Joan Rivers, whose decision to launch a competing show was seen by Carson as a personal betrayal. He rarely spoke about it directly, but in later interviews, his sarcastic tone and subtle hints made it clear that certain disappointments were never forgotten. Additionally, Carson went through deeply painful personal moments that shaped his reserved demeanor and his need for control. One of the most devastating episodes was the death of his son, Richard, in 1991 in a car accident, which left Carson shaken and profoundly withdrawn. Close friends reported that he isolated himself for weeks, struggling to cope with the loss, and that this trauma further reinforced his tendency to maintain emotional distance, even from close family members. Over the years, he also faced the natural wear and tear of fame, the highs and lows of television, and public criticism that, although rare, were felt intensely. The impact of these experiences was reflected in his controversial statements about the entertainment industry, politics, and human behavior, always delivered with a mix of biting humor and disarming honesty. Even in the face of all this, Carson continued to perform flawlessly on stage, making millions laugh while carrying an invisible emotional burden. This duality, the confident entertainer and the tormented man, reveals the complexity of his personality and explains why he remains a fascinating figure, someone who seemed to have it all, but internally struggled with losses, disappointments, and resentments that few knew. His controversial statements and difficult moments not only humanize the icon, but also show how he managed to balance genius and vulnerability, creating a legacy that is admired, studied, and discussed to this day, with a mixture of fascination and empathy for the man who smiled at the world while facing his own storms. After dominating television for decades and making millions laugh, Johnny Carson chose to hide from the world, as if the brilliance he himself created had tired him to the point of invisibility. When Carson retired from The Tonight Show in 1992, the public expected him to continue shining in some way: interviews, appearances, tributes, perhaps even a new television project. But what happened was exactly the opposite. He withdrew almost completely from public life, choosing to live away from the spotlight in Malibu, in a discreet seaside home, surrounded only by close friends and intimate family members. It was a surprising choice for someone who had spent more than 30 years in the center of attention, where every word, every gesture, and every smile were watched and analyzed by the entire country. Despite the isolation, those who had access to him during this period described Carson as surprisingly friendly, witty, and even playful in private situations, though very reserved. He rarely spoke about his career or about television, preferring to focus on reading, fishing, and everyday life, away from the pressure of producing laughter for millions of people every night. It is fascinating to think that the man who conducted interviews with politicians, Hollywood stars, and comedians with such skill and control found his peace in silence and solitude. But this decision did not come without controversy or intense public curiosity. There was a sense that Carson had disappeared without explanation, fueling rumors, speculation, and even some criticism that he had abandoned the fans who loved him so much. He did not give formal interviews for years, declined invitations to extravagant tributes, and avoided any media exposure that might remind him of his life in the spotlight. Even at private parties or smaller events, Carson was selective and attentive, maintaining a delicate balance between social interaction and preserving his privacy. However, he was not completely reclusive. Close friends report that he still had a sharp sense of humor and remarkable observational skills, capable of making witty remarks in any situation, but always within a restricted circle. Carson's death on January 23, 2005, due to respiratory complications related to emphysema, marked the end of a life that had been both public and extraordinarily private. His television legacy is monumental, but what fascinates most is the way he chose to spend his final days, not with farewell parties or grand autobiographies, but with a simple, protected, and peaceful life, far from the spotlight he himself had created, reminding us that sometimes even the greatest icons need silence to truly find peace. Carson managed to leave the world with laughter, stories, and memories, but he kept for himself the right to disappear in the way he wanted, showing that true freedom for him lay in being able to control his own narrative up to the very last moment.